If there's one thing I've learned about suburban life in America, it's that the real danger isn't burglars or wild animals. It's the HOA. Yes, the Homeowners Association. You know, that group of self-appointed neighborhood overlords who think they're running a mini dictatorship. And at the helm of our HOA was Karen, a name that fits her personality so perfectly, I sometimes wonder if she legally changed it just to embody the stereotype. I had barely unpacked my boxes when Karen made her grand entrance into my life. Picture this. I'm standing in my driveway, admiring the new house I just bought after years of saving up, when suddenly a woman in a pastel cardigan and oversized sunglasses marches up to me like she's auditioning for a role as a villain in a soap opera. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Are you aware that your mailbox is half an inch too tall?" I blinked. What?" Karen sighed dramatically, as if explaining basic geometry to a toddler. "Your mailbox. It violates HOA regulations. Page 47, Section 3B. Mailboxes must be no taller than 42 inches from the ground. Yours is 42 and a half. I stared at her, wondering if this was some kind of hazing ritual for new homeowners. But no, Karen was dead serious. She whipped out a clipboard with what looked like an entire encyclopedia of rules and regulations and began rattling off infractions like she was handing out parking tickets. "Your trash cans are visible from the street, violation. Your lawn isn't the right shade of green, violation. And don't even get me started on those flower pots. Are those daisies? We only permit tulips or hydrangeas." At this point, I was torn between laughing and crying. Who knew moving into a suburban neighborhood meant signing up for military-grade micromanagement? But Karen wasn't done yet. Oh no, she saved her piece de resistance for last. "And one more thing," she said, narrowing her eyes at me like I'd personally insulted her ancestors. "You're not allowed to have fences taller than 4 feet. Now, here's the thing. I didn't even have a fence yet, but I had been planning to build one. A simple wooden fence to keep my dog, Max, from wandering into Karen's perfectly manicured lawn and accidentally stepping on one of her sacred hydrangeas. Okay," I said cautiously. "I'll make sure it's within the rules." Karen gave me a tight-lipped smile that could curdle milk. "Good, because we take these things very seriously around here." And with that, she turned on her heel and strutted away like she'd just won a courtroom battle. Fast forward 2 weeks later. I had built my modest little wooden fence. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep Max contained and give me some semblance of privacy from Karen's constant surveillance. Yes, she had binoculars. For about 3 days, life was peaceful. But then came the complaint. Karen showed up at my door again, this time armed with photos of my fence taken from every possible angle, as if she were preparing evidence for an FBI investigation. "This fence is unacceptable," she declared. I frowned. "What do you mean? It's exactly 4 feet tall." Karen sniffed disdainfully. "It's an eyesore. It ruins the aesthetic of the neighborhood." I looked at my plain wooden fence and then at Karen's house, which was painted in a shade of pink so loud it could give Barbie whiplash. "Right? Because this is ruining the aesthetic." Karen ignored my sarcasm and handed me an official HOA violation notice with a fine attached. $500 for non-compliance. She then proceeded to lecture me about how fences should be tasteful and blend seamlessly into the environment. Apparently, my fence wasn't tasteful enough for her royal standards. At this point, I realized 2 things. First, Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was inventing them as she went along. And second, this wasn't about my fence at all. This was about power. Karen wanted control over everything in the neighborhood, including me. Now, I could have backed down and replaced my fence with something more tasteful, like wrought iron or hedges shaped into unicorns. Because let's be honest, nothing would satisfy Karen unless it looked like it belonged in Versailles. But instead, I decided to do something far more satisfying: fight back. You see, Karen had messed with the wrong guy. I wasn't just some pushover who'd roll over every time she waved her clipboard around like it was Excalibur. No, I was Daniel, the guy who once spent 3 weeks fighting Comcast over hidden fees just because it annoyed me on principle. So when Karen declared war on my fence, well, let's just say I wasn't going down without a fight. And thus began my plan. A plan so outrageous it would make Karen regret ever messing with me. But first things first, I needed reinforcements. Jake, I said over the phone to my best friend/engineer buddy, who loved chaos almost as much as I did. How do you feel about helping me build something completely insane? Jake laughed on the other end of the line. What are we talking? A moat? A trebuchet? Close, I said with a grin. A 15-foot steel barricade. There was silence for about 3 seconds before Jake burst out laughing again. You're serious? Dead serious. Jake didn't even hesitate. Count me in. And just like that, Operation Steel Barricade was born. A revenge plan so ridiculous it would make Karen wish she'd never picked up that clipboard in the first place. The first sign that Karen had escalated her campaign of terror was the tow truck. I woke up one sunny morning to the sound of hydraulic squealing and rushed outside to find a man in a reflective vest hooking my perfectly parked car to the back of his truck. Whoa, whoa, whoa! What's going on here? I shouted. Karen appeared out of nowhere, clipboard in hand, like some kind of bureaucratic ninja. Your car is parked at an angle that violates HOA regulations, she declared, pointing to a section of her clipboard that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. I looked at my car. It was parked at a perfectly normal angle in my driveway. What angle? It's a driveway. It's supposed to be parked like this. Karen sniffed. It's not parallel to the curb. It's not supposed to be parallel to the curb. It's in my driveway. Karen ignored me and waved at the tow truck driver, who looked as confused as I felt. Proceed, she ordered. I had to bribe the guy with coffee and donuts just to get him to leave without taking my car. But that wasn't the worst of it. A week later, I caught Karen in my yard with a tape measure, scowling at my grass like it had personally offended her. Your lawn is exactly 2 inches longer than HOA guidelines allow, she said, scribbling furiously on her clipboard. Are you serious? I asked, incredulous. It rained yesterday. Grass grows. Karen didn't even look up. Ignorance of the rules is no excuse. By this point, it was clear that Karen wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was inventing them on the fly. And she wasn't stopping at petty fines or passive-aggressive letters. No, Karen had moved on to full-blown warfare. She called city inspectors on me, claiming my fence was a safety hazard. She sent me daily violation notices for everything from my porch light being too bright to my recycling bin being too visible. She even tried to have Max, my dog, declared a nuisance because he barked once when a squirrel ran by. It was absurd. It was infuriating. And it was time for me to fight back. Jake, I said over the phone one night, pacing my living room like a general plotting his next move. I need your help. Jake, my best friend and an engineer with a penchant for chaos, didn't even hesitate. What are we building? A barricade, I said with a grin. A 15-foot steel barricade. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jake burst out laughing. You're joking. I'm dead serious. Jake laughed even harder. This is going to be amazing. The next morning, Jake showed up at my house with blueprints and a truckload of steel beams. We spent hours sketching out designs and calculating dimensions while Max watched us from his spot on the couch, wagging his tail like he knew something epic was about to happen. By the end of the day, we had a plan. A towering steel wall that would make Fort Knox look like an open-air market. It would be completely legal. Karen couldn't accuse me of breaking any rules, and it would block her view of my yard so thoroughly that she'd need a drone just to spy on me. Construction began at dawn 2 days later. The sound of power tools echoed through the neighborhood as Jake and I worked tirelessly to assemble our masterpiece. Karen appeared within minutes, storming up my driveway in her bathrobe and slippers. What is this? She shrieked, waving her clipboard like it was some kind of magical weapon. It's a barricade, I said cheerfully. This is unacceptable, she snapped. You can't just build this. It violates community standards. I pulled out a copy of the HOA guidelines, the same ones Karen had been using as her personal Bible, and flipped to the relevant section. Actually, I said smugly, there's nothing in here that says I can't build this. Karen's face turned redder than her hydrangeas in full bloom. This is an eyesore. It's offensive. It's destroying property values. That's funny, I said innocently. You said the same thing about my wooden fence. Karen sputtered incoherently for a moment before storming off, muttering something about calling an emergency HOA meeting. The barricade took 3 days to complete, and by the time we were done, it was glorious, 15 feet tall, made of reinforced steel panels painted in matte black for maximum intimidation factor. It looked less like a fence and more like something you'd see surrounding Area 51. The neighborhood reaction was mixed. Some people were horrified, it looks like a prison wall, while others thought it was hilarious. Karen finally met her match. Mike, my neighbor from across the street, stopped by with a 6-pack of beer and declared it the greatest thing this neighborhood has ever seen. As for Karen, she lost her mind. She filed 3 official complaints with the HOA within 24 hours, demanding that I take down the barricade immediately. When those complaints went nowhere, because technically I hadn't broken any rules, she escalated her crusade by threatening legal action. "You'll regret this," she yelled from her front yard one afternoon as I admired my handiwork from behind my new steel fortress. "Bring it on," I yelled back, and thus began what would later be known as the Battle of Steel Wall. Karen wasn't just fighting for control anymore, she was fighting for her pride. But little did she know, so was I. By the time the steel barricade was fully erected, it had become the talk of the town. People were driving by just to gawk at it, some snapping pictures like it was a tourist attraction. Others whispered conspiratorially, probably wondering if I was preparing for an alien invasion or hiding something illegal behind it. One neighbor even asked me if I was starting a private militia. But there was one person who wasn't amused, Karen. Karen's reaction was everything I had hoped for and more. She stormed out of her house the morning after construction finished, clutching her clipboard like it was a holy relic, and marched straight to my driveway. Her face was so red, I briefly wondered if she might spontaneously combust. "What is this?" she screeched, pointing at the wall as if she'd discovered a portal to hell. "It's my new fence," I said casually, sipping coffee from my favorite mug that read "World's Okayest Neighbor." "Do you like it?" Karen's jaw dropped so far I thought she might dislocate it. This is outrageous. It's a monstrosity. It's an insult to the entire neighborhood." I shrugged. "Well, you said my wooden fence wasn't tasteful enough. So I upgraded." Karen sputtered incoherently for a few seconds before regaining her composure, or at least as much composure as someone like Karen could muster. "This violates every HOA rule in existence," she declared. "Actually," I said with a grin, pulling out my copy of the HOA guidelines, "it doesn't." I checked. Karen snatched the document from my hand and flipped through it furiously, her eyes darting back and forth as she searched for some clause, any clause, that would justify tearing down my masterpiece. But there was nothing. The HOA rules were surprisingly vague when it came to fences, and technically my steel barricade fell within the legal height limit. This isn't over," Karen hissed, thrusting the guidelines back at me like they were contaminated. Then she stomped off, muttering something about calling an emergency HOA meeting. The emergency meeting happened 2 days later in Karen's living room, a space that looked less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to pastel decor and passive-aggressive motivational quotes. "Live, laugh, love" hung crookedly above her fireplace. I suspected Max had barked at it once. Karen had assembled her loyal followers, mostly retirees with nothing better to do than complain about lawn ornaments, and launched into a dramatic speech about how my steel wall was ruining property values and destroying the soul of the community. She even brought a slideshow featuring unflattering angles of the wall taken from her backyard. How she got those photos without trespassing remains a mystery. "This eyesore is unacceptable," Karen declared, slamming her clipboard on the coffee table for emphasis. "We must take action." The crowd murmured in agreement, though Mike, my beer-loving neighbor, raised his hand and asked, "Is this really worse than your pink house?" Karen ignored him. Meanwhile, I was busy enjoying life behind my impenetrable fortress. For the first time since moving in, I felt truly free. No more surprise inspections from Karen. No more passive-aggressive notes left on my porch. No more binoculars peeking through her curtains like some suburban big brother. Max loved it too. He spent hours running laps around the yard without fear of Karen's wrath or tape measures invading his personal space. At one point, he even peed on the wall, a symbolic victory if ever there was one. But Karen wasn't done with me yet. The day after her emergency meeting, she escalated her campaign by calling city inspectors to investigate my property. 2 men in official-looking uniforms showed up at my door with clipboards. Apparently Karen had inspired them and informed me they were here to assess whether my wall posed a safety hazard. Safety hazard? I repeated incredulously. "It's a fence. The inspectors exchanged awkward glances before one of them cleared his throat and said, "Well, your neighbor claims it could fall over during high winds." I stared at them for a moment before bursting into laughter. "It's made of reinforced steel. What kind of tornado are we talking about here?" The inspectors didn't seem amused, but after spending half an hour examining every inch of the barricade and probably realizing Karen had wasted their time, they left without issuing any citations. Karen's next move was even more desperate: bribery. One afternoon, while Jake and I were grilling burgers in my backyard, because what better way to celebrate victory than with charred meat, Karen approached us carrying a tray of cookies that looked suspiciously store-bought. "I'd like to make you an offer," she said sweetly, or rather, as sweetly as someone who hates your guts can manage. Jake raised an eyebrow while I took a bite of my burger and said, "I'm listening." Karen smiled tightly and gestured toward the cookies like they were part of some elaborate peace treaty. "If you agree to take down this structure, I'll personally cover all fines associated with your previous violations." Jake snorted into his beer while I leaned back in my chair and pretended to think it over. I said after a moment, tempting, but no. Karen's smile vanished faster than free samples at Costco. "You'll regret this," she snapped before storming off yet again. By now, Karen had become something of a local legend, or perhaps infamy is a better word. People started calling her Steel Wall Karen, and rumors swirled about how far she'd go to win this battle. Some claimed she'd hired private investigators to dig up dirt on me. Others joked that she'd petition Congress for new HOA laws. But nothing could stop me or my wall. In fact, things took an unexpected turn when Mike suggested we throw a block party to celebrate its completion. "It's not every day you see someone stand up to Karen," he said with a grin. "We should make this historic." And so we did. The party was epic. Barbecue grills lined the street, kids ran around with balloons shaped like steel beams, someone even brought karaoke, though thankfully no one sang. The highlight of the evening came when Jake unveiled his latest creation, a miniature replica of the wall made entirely out of cake, and everyone cheered as we cut into it like we were celebrating Independence Day. Karen watched from her window the entire time, glaring daggers at us while clutching her binoculars so tightly I thought they might shatter. Victory had never tasted so sweet or so petty. But little did Karen know, this wasn't just about winning anymore. This was about making sure she never forgot who she messed with and ensuring that everyone else in the neighborhood knew exactly what happens when you try to play dictator in Daniel's backyard. And trust me, things were only going to get better from here. The first sign that Karen's reign of terror was unraveling came in the form of a letter. Not just any letter, this one was from the HOA's legal team. I found it stuffed in my mailbox one morning, sandwiched between a coupon for half-off pizza and a flyer for a local dog grooming service. Max promptly shredded that one. The letter was short, formal, and dripping with legalese, but the gist was clear. Karen had overstepped her authority. Apparently, her relentless campaign against my steel barricade had caught the attention of the HOA board. They weren't thrilled about the mounting complaints from other neighbors who were sick of Karen's antics. It turned out I wasn't her only victim. She'd been fining people for things like unapproved garden gnomes and unauthorized holiday lights. One poor guy got slapped with a $200 fine because his Christmas wreath was too large for his door. The HOA board had finally had enough. They scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss Karen's behavior, and this time, I was invited to attend. The meeting took place in the community center, a beige building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Karen sat at the head of the table, clutching her infamous clipboard like it was a life raft. Her loyal minions flanked her on either side, but their usual smug confidence seemed to have evaporated. I walked in with a stack of evidence. Photos of my perfectly legal barricade, copies of every ridiculous violation notice Karen had sent me, and a video compilation of Max barking at her through the fence, purely for comedic effect. Mike, my beer-loving neighbor, tagged along for moral support, and because he wanted to see Karen squirm. The meeting began with the HOA president clearing his throat awkwardly. "We're here to address some concerns regarding Mrs. Karen Thompson's conduct as head of the HOA. Karen immediately launched into a tirade about how she was just upholding community standards, and how my barricade was a blight on the neighborhood. She even tried to accuse me of building it out of spite." "Spite?" I said, feigning innocence. "Karen, you're giving me far too much credit. I built that barricade for privacy and to protect Max from your enthusiasm." Mike snorted into his soda. The HOA president held up a hand to silence us. Mr. Daniel has provided substantial evidence that his barricade complies with all HOA regulations, he said. Furthermore, we've received numerous complaints about Mrs. Thompson's excessive enforcement tactics. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of purple. Excessive? I'm protecting this community. By fining people for garden gnomes? Mike interjected. The room erupted into murmurs as other neighbors chimed in with their own horror stories. One woman recounted how Karen had threatened to tow her car because it was too old for the neighborhood aesthetic. Another man revealed that Karen had once measured his hedges with a ruler and issued a violation because they were half an inch too tall. It became clear that Karen wasn't protecting the community. She was terrorizing it. As the meeting dragged on, Karen's defenses crumbled faster than a cheap cookie. She tried to argue that she was just following the rules. But when someone pointed out that she'd been inventing rules as she went along, she had no response. Then came the bombshell. One neighbor revealed that Karen had been misusing HOA funds for years. Apparently, she'd been funneling money into unnecessary projects, like repainting her own house under the guise of community beautification. The HOA president confirmed that an audit was underway. Karen looked like she might faint. The final blow came when the HOA board voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position as head of the association. She tried to protest, but it was no use. The decision was final. As she stormed out of the room in defeat, I couldn't resist calling after her. Don't worry, Karen. If you need help packing up your clipboard collection, let me know. Mike nearly choked on his soda from laughing so hard. With Karen dethroned, life in the neighborhood returned to normal, or as normal as it could be with a 15-foot steel barricade dominating my yard. The new HOA president, a reasonable woman named Linda, reached out to me personally to apologize for everything I'd been through. You've shown remarkable patience, she said during our first meeting. And creativity. Creativity is one word for it, I replied with a grin. Linda assured me that there would be no further issues with my barricade or any other aspect of my property. She even suggested hosting a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate Karen's departure, a suggestion I wholeheartedly endorsed. The barbecue turned out to be an even bigger event than Mike's block party. Neighbors who had barely spoken before bonded over burgers and beers while kids played games in my yard. Max supervised. Someone brought karaoke again, this time with a playlist dedicated entirely to songs about walls. Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd was a crowd favorite. At one point during the festivities, Linda approached me with an idea. What if we turned my steel barricade into an art installation? She suggested inviting local artists to paint murals on it as a way to bring the community together. I loved the idea, and so did everyone else. Within weeks, my once intimidating barricade transformed into a vibrant canvas covered in colorful artwork depicting everything from flowers and animals to abstract designs. Even Max got his own portrait on one panel. As for Karen, rumor has it she sold her house and moved out of state shortly after losing her position on the HOA board. Some say she joined another HOA elsewhere. Others claim she went off-grid entirely, probably building clipboards out of tree bark. Either way, no one missed her. In the end, my steel barricade became more than just a symbol of defiance. It became a symbol of community resilience and creativity. And every time I look at it now, I'm reminded that sometimes revenge isn't just sweet. It's also incredibly satisfying.